welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. pater.ballerstedt is also known as Don Pedro, the Sodfather and the leader of the ruminati. He is a forage agronomist and ruminant nutritionist. He received his doctorate from the University of Kentucky and became the extension forage specialist at Oregon State University in 1986. His personal experience led him to re-examine the best human health and diet and how that relates to the health of the planet and animals. As we said, he is the leader of the ruminati, a group of people who share his passion for his message of sustainability. He has spoken at many events all over the world and writes his blogs at Grass-Based Health. He recently began podcasting prolifically with his show, Meet Your Herdmates. He currently lives with his wife and dog in Oregon. Pater.ballerstedt, the Sodfather, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Casey. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's absolutely an honor to host you here. What is the point of humor in your life? We're going to talk about some pretty serious things, but you have a way of talking about things that makes them very light and humorous.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. I mean, I've learned over my life that many things I think are funny, other people just kind of give me a look. But part of it is to just lighten up about some things while being effective at communicating information. And hopefully I can achieve that. I think humor allows us to kind of let down some of our barriers maybe, and we can form relationships, which I think we really, really need to do.
I totally agree. We have to ask, we love the name the Sodfather. How was the title of the Sodfather bequeathed upon thee?
I really wish I could, I suspect I remember, but I'm not certain. So someone had to give me that title, and I didn't even think of the ruminati. I mean, so other people have given me these things, and I'm a leverager. As soon as I see a good idea, it's like, okay, we'll use it. So that and I do remember who gave me the title of Don Pedro. So we string it all together, and it's just, again, more of this attempt to be humorous while at the same time making the case that ruminant animal agriculture is essential for human flourishing, has been, is now, and will be in the future. And that there's lots and lots of people who understand to a greater degree than I do certain specific specialties across the space that encompasses food production through its consumption and human health. But we've been isolated. We get more specialized, and we get, into our silos. And my attempt is just to bring all this information together so that people can access it more easily, and then just feel better about making decisions that may, in fact, as I also advocate, improve their lives. And so, stop worrying about some of the things that you hear, focus on improving your health, and we can communicate some information along the way.
Well, I think that's great. I do think you are very funny. So, whether you are or not, that says something about me, I suppose. Before we talk about...
Well, clearly you have a very discerning sense of humor, so we'll get along well.
Thank you, sir. Before we talk about some of these really important things, you have a very interesting story. And I want to hear your background, not only professionally, but also health-wise, if you can tie those two together, because they're isolated, but they're very much related. And I think it's a very interesting story.
Well, okay. So I was not born on a farm. I don't come from an agricultural background. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, but I discovered I liked the country more than I liked suburbia, and certainly more than I liked the city. Although really, I haven't given all cities a chance. I visit, but, I grew up outside Philly, so that's where that got started. And along the way, I was given the opportunity to start studying subjects related to agriculture that progressed. And by 1986, I had graduated from University of Kentucky, moved to Oregon State University, and was there for 6 years, left agriculture, went into high tech, worked there for several years. But by 2007, I was a 51-year-old balding, obese pre-diabetic. And my wife, Nancy, had for, I guess, 5 years by that point been looking into low carb as a dietary approach. And if anyone's been around this space long enough to remember what things were like in 2002, there wasn't a lot, but certainly nothing like what we have today. And so she was reading and, books and what was available on the web. And, she was trying things. She was very wise in her approach, which was to say, this is what I'd like to eat. What would you like to eat? And so I tried some things, plus and minus with the success. I guess my weight loss story was not much and not for long. But by 2007, I was finally, okay, something has to change. And I then was able to read the sources that she had been reading, and about a year later, maybe. Well, actually, I guess it was Christmas of 2007. So then the following year, Gary Taubes's Good Calories, Bad Calories came out, and of course, Protein Power Life Plan was already out, and that was the diet I mostly followed. And so I did that for a few years, and then in 2010, there was a joint conference, the Nutrition Metabolism Society and the American Society of Bariatric Physicians were meeting in Seattle, and that was only 5 hours away. And I'm looking at the speaker list, and here's Gary Taubes is going to be there. And I think Steve Finney was going to be there, and Eric Westman was going to be there, and Jimmy Moore was going to be there to, I think, be in the audience. And I think at some point I learned that Dr. Michael Eads was going to be there. So all these people, I was like, yeah, 5 hours, I'm going to go. And I had been out of agriculture for several years, but this was the first time I identified myself by my training as a forage agronomist. And that taught me, one, that I knew some things already that a lot of medical practitioners weren't aware of, apparently, from interactions I had at this conference. But more, I knew things about animal source food production that these people didn't know. And I'm also convinced that people in my animal source food production tribe need to know the information that these metabolic health practitioners and researchers have to share. And so that then started me on the whole grass-based health journey.
That's such a cool story. I think for me, I came at this from the side of the nutrition, just working with clients as a personal trainer and nutritionist, just finding what works. Like, I don't care whether somebody eats one way or another way. I really don't get paid whether you eat meat or don't eat meat, or you're vegan, vegetarian, like, great, do whatever you want. This is what I found that works for the most people. And so this is what I'm going to do until somebody shows me a better way. And I notice that if you decide to eat this way, pretty soon you have to confront some pretty difficult emotions, understanding that you are killing an animal and potentially destroying the planet. And, most of the people that I speak with in this space, they're not savage. They're not they don't want to kill animals. They love animals. Scott Mislinski hosts the Carnivore Cast. Him and I send puppy pictures back and forth all the time. And I find that there's a lot of really kind-hearted and good people in this world. And there's also this message that if you eat animals, you are destroying the planet. And that's hard to reconcile. And so what I wanted to do is go through a few different myths and things that we just kind of assume and ask you to kind of comment or say whether they're true or false and maybe the context behind them, if you don't mind.
Happy to do it.
Awesome. First one. Everybody knows this one. Everybody knows that cow farts are destroying the planet.
Well, first of all, the methane isn't from the farts, it's from the belches. Maybe that only matters to me, but I think that indicates the quality of the conversation that's taken place if we've gotten it that wrong. Number two is that the methane that any ruminant, so wild or domestic, it's part of the process of ruminant digestion. This emission of what we call enteric methane. But that methane came from plant matter. And that plant matter came through photosynthesis from CO2 that was in the atmosphere. So now we've got CO2 being taken up by plants, converted into carbohydrate. It's eaten by ruminant animals. Some portion of that gets burped out as methane, but that methane only resides in the atmosphere for about 10 years. It is oxidized to CO2 and completes that cycle. So there's no enrichment of CO2 in this process. Contrast that with the burning of fossil fuels, which represents an increase in CO2 because we're taking this hydrocarbon and burning it and releasing CO2. That's another important difference or point. And then the last point that I'll mention is when you look at the entire methane budget, so methane emissions can come from natural as well as what we call anthropogenic, man-produced sources. And the budget is roughly split about 60-40 anthropogenic to natural. Okay. So natural sources is still big. If you could wipe out, you'd still have methane being emitted. Okay, that's one point. If you then look at what is the cattle contribution to that, it is less than 3% of the anthropogenic portion, or less than 2% of the total budget.
Wow.
It's not nothing. It's not nothing. It's there. Okay, we can see it. And then finally, what we should understand is if you could look at methane emissions from cattle and look at them from US, Western Europe, and the developing countries, you'd see that in the US, they've been flat since the 60s. In Europe, they've been declining since about the 70s or so. And they're dramatically increasing in the low and middle income countries, the so-called developing countries. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on the right things and the right places and that we understand all that's there. But the much shorter answer is no, it is not true that cow farts are destroying the world.
Wow, good start. Thanks for that. One thing that somebody's told me recently is that methane cycles for 10 years. I was familiar with that. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, carbon dioxide is more of like a 1,000-year cycle. Is that correct?
Yes. Those are figures. Mm-hmm.
Okay, gotcha. But I've heard that methane is more dangerous in the environment than CO2 is. Is that part of it true? Even though you've just established that cows don't contribute a whole heck of a lot. You said there's some, certainly. So is that more destructive than CO2?
Well, so the first word you used was dangerous. If you're in a confined space and you build up methane, it is explosive. That's what blows up coal mines, those sorts of things, right? Gas leaks, natural gas, is CH4, methane. So, okay, set that off to the side. It is that a molecule of methane is understood to have a greater warming potential than a molecule of carbon dioxide. That is part of the conversation. Okay. And that's true, but then you have to add all these other factors into it. And so typically we talk about CO2 equivalents because there are three greenhouse gases. There's carbon dioxide that are typically discussed. There's carbon dioxide, there's methane, and then there's nitrous compounds, nitrogen, oxygen compounds, various kinds. And the warming potential of those is CO2 is less than methane, is less than the nitrous compounds.
Wow. Okay, so tell me, this is another myth that basically animal agriculture is responsible for all of the methane and agriculture of plants is not.
That's not true. The cultivation of rice, for example, is a significant source of methane emission. If you look at all of agriculture in the U.S., and again, it's really important that you don't misapply global statistics to a individual nation's economy and its statistics. In the United States, it's thought that somewhere in the 9 to 10% of all its anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are from the agriculture, forestry, and land use category. So they split up the budget into different industry sectors. So, call it 10%. That's compared to energy at 28%, roughly the same thing for transportation. You get the idea. So it's there, it's significant, okay, but not at the relative level that some people have said. So now let's just focus on agriculture total. Total agriculture is somewhere in the 9% range. Livestock agriculture is 4%.
Wow. 4.
4. So beef is 2. So livestock agriculture is less than half of the emissions that are coming from all of agriculture, which means that plant agriculture is more, and now beef is less than half of livestock. Okay, so that's kind of the landscape that you need to understand when you hear the conversations. Can we improve? Yes, absolutely. But fundamentally, if you are producing crops that require a lot of mechanical cultural practices, be it plowing, planting, cultivating, spraying, harvesting, all that is currently driven by fossil fuels. Okay, as opposed to we have animals that are harvesting as much of their feed as possible. Obviously, I'm talking about ruminant animal agriculture, grazing animals. So those are some fundamental differences, and that's before we ever look at, okay, what's the energy cost of processing these things? Because the majority of humanity does not eat the plants in their natural state, right? They're processed into foods. Our processing takes energy. That's a contribution somewhere. And then it has to be transported to market, and then you have to account for food waste. And all of those things just more and more and more shift the favor toward animal source foods. And we haven't even gotten to human health yet.
No, and we're going to go there. I had a post that I made. I was at the store. I had, 2 pounds of ground beef that I was buying, and the family in front of me, not super healthy. I'm not shaming them. They just didn't look super healthy, but they just filled the conveyor belt with all kinds of like products and fake butter and almond milk and even like tons of fresh fruits and vegetables. But like, I remember the cauliflower was wrapped in plastic and then put into a plastic bag. And all of these things where did they come from? Do you think they just went to the back of the store and pulled it out of the ground for you? Like, this food is not native here. It doesn't grow here. So who picked it? Where did it come from? When did it come from? How long did it take to get here? And I'm, destroying the planet by buying 2 pounds of ground beef. This is food for me for like 2 days. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We did about a year ago experience disruption in our food distribution systems. We take this for granted that we can go to the local market and whatever we want is going to be there in a remarkable array at a remarkably low cost to us relative to our income. There are parts of the world where 40 to 50% of income is spent on food.
Wow.
So, it's easy to criticize, especially if we've become complacent. There was a long time ago, I came across a comment about the hungry boy doesn't contemplate burning down the granary. That was like a literal translation from an African proverb, right?
Wow.
The hungry man or the fed man says, "There's a worm in this apple," and the hungry man says, "Yeah, let me see."
I love that.
So all of that kind of stuff frequently isn't part of our conversation when we think about sustainable food systems, and it needs to be.
I agree. Interesting. Okay, this one kills me. Cows use a massive amount of water.
Well, yeah. So you should pardon the expression. I've said before that the emissions figures have been inflated and the water consumption figures have been bloated. One of the tricks you have to watch out for is there have been estimates published in which they say it's going to take you so many acres to raise a cow calf and then ultimately the animal that goes to slaughter. Okay, so whatever those acres are, we're going to estimate what the average rainfall is. And, if it's 20 inches, well, an acre inch of water is like 27 some thousand inches. It's over 25,000 gallons of water per acre inch. They're going to assume all that went to produce the calf, not that some of it evaporated, some of it ran off, some of it ran into the soil, some of it was taken up by plants. Gee, I wonder how the feed grew that the calf ate and is transpired out. So that's the quality of some of these estimates. Number two is it's not as if these animals destroy the water. They're part of the cycle that takes place. Rainfall falls onto the ground. Again, some of it runs off into streams. Some of it goes down to the water table. Some of it is evaporated from the soil surface, some from plant surfaces. The animal eats some of the plants. It respires some of that in its breath. Also, it urinates and defecates and returns moisture to the soil. And so this is a cycling of water every bit as much as the CO2 cycling that I talked about earlier. And yet people talk about this as if that water somehow disappears from Earth and is never seen again.
Right. Yeah, it's on the front end, they're making assumptions on the numbers and then not considering anything on the back end that, yes, this is a cycle. Like, it's got to go somewhere, like you said. Interesting.
And we could also add that if you're saying animal versus plant source food production, properly managed and that's a key word, and we could come back to that, but grasslands are better for the watersheds than are clean till cultivated vegetable production,
Mm.
right? If you've ever driven by an almond orchard, for example, one of the things that may strike you is that there's no vegetation underneath those trees. You could see it here in Oregon with hazelnut production and many other sorts of fruit, nut production systems. You can see that. If you're growing, commodity grains, you're going to see something similar. Clearly, what they're doing is getting as much of other vegetation out so that they have what we would call a monoculture. Well, we don't do that in pasture or rangeland management. And then the other thing that has to be acknowledged is most of the ground suitable to agriculture is not suitable for the production of human utilizable foodstuffs.
Mm. Yeah, that's super interesting. I remember after reading Lear Keith's book, A Vegetarian Myth, driving by a farm where they were monocropping some vegetable, I can't remember what it was, and you look and all you see is that one plant. And in the corner of the farm where they're not growing really anything, you notice there's different plants, and there's lots of different plants and unique and different flowers. And at first you look at something like that and say, wow, look at all those plants and look at all that life. But now I look at it and say, like, that's a massive amount of death. So many things had to die for that, that food to be planted. That's just is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Well, it's cows are bigger. They're what is it? The anthropomorphizing animals. We have become separated from, and so it's easy then to imagine back into things that were that separate from things that don't exist there if you're really connected. And if you're going to till soil, you're going to impact soil or ground dwelling animals.
Mm.
You're also going to do, and those animals exist at a variety of scales. So if you just talk about the life within the soil, you're going from microscopic all the way up to macroscopic, which would include earthworms as well as moles and gophers and other animals that live in the soil. If you just talk about the microscopic, I've heard estimates that say that the life below the soil surface in weight is equal to the weight of the cattle grazing above the surface.
I've heard that too. That's so cool to contemplate.
And when you till the ground, you do impact that below the surface biological activity, and if we're learning more and more about that, so it's easy to not see the impacts and therefore fall for the assumption that they don't exist.
Mm. Interesting. Okay, next one. Since you know so many of them, cattle ranchers are cruel and abusive. When you see them at conferences, they're just a bunch of jerks. They just want to go kill a bunch of animals.
Yeah, clearly. There's an awful lot of effort that people in the most people in animal agriculture have as their chief concern animal welfare. Now, there's a fundamental difference between animal welfare and animal rights. And everyone involved in animal agriculture, with a few exceptions, and there's always those tragic exceptions anywhere, are concerned about animal welfare for a number of reasons, but to devolve it to its most base one, that's where profit lies. If you're not concerned with animal welfare, your animals are stressed, your animals are not, dare I say, performing at the level that you need them to be performing in order for you to not incur unnecessary cost, and therefore have the level of production and efficiency that you need in order to survive as a business. That there, okay, let's put that on the table. And I know that some people aren't comfortable with the idea that agriculture is a business. We could come back to that, but okay. Number two is, so many of these operations are multi-generational. And again, I'm speaking primarily of the ruminant agriculture, but it's true across agriculture. Now, some of these are not only multi-generational, in other words, my father and my grandfather were farmers, but here, we've been here that long. Okay, that's kind of unique amongst Americans. We tend to move around a lot. And then if you're in the cattle industry, you have some of these herds that go back that far, so you may still be reaping the benefits of your grandfather's decisions in terms of the herd the genetics that you're managing. Or maybe, he made some bad decisions. I mean, that happens too. There are certain trends, not trends, I'd call them fads maybe, that come through livestock, so people get really concerned about breeding for certain traits, and they focus too much on those, and okay, then problems show up, and then you've got to correct them over time. But I guess imagine walking the same ground that your grandfather walked, and in some cases longer. I just spoke to a woman who's fifth generation raising the sixth generation.
Wow.
And so imagine what that's like. And imagine also, here's a story that I got from a friend in Montana. He's a physician there, and one day he gets a phone call from the emergency medicine department, or urgent care or whatever it was, saying, "Could you please come talk sense to your patient?" And so he shows up, and it turns out that the patient has come in exhibiting signs of having had a heart attack. And they're trying to get him checked in. And he's saying, "No, I can't. No, I won't." And so now my friend's job is to try to get him checked in. And, what the rancher says is, "Doc, I'll sign whatever it takes to absolve anybody from any problem that happens. And I will come in tomorrow morning and undergo whatever procedures need to be done. But I have cows to take care of."
Wow.
And I haven't made those arrangements. They need to be cared for tonight. Okay, I have to go do that. I'll be back in the morning.
Wow.
Cows come first.
Wow. That's a great story.
And in some of the parts of our world, of North America, people are caring for livestock in winter under conditions that mean you're putting your life at risk to go out there.
Wow.
Okay, so now you're going to tell me that they're abusing the animals. It makes no sense. And part of that, again, we can see in some cases staged, in some cases it actually happened that way. Horror stories, and everyone in animal agriculture is working to eliminate that. But at the same time, we can see the horror stories that occur when people follow, a vegan diet. And again, I don't care what somebody chooses to eat. I do want people to have enough information to make a truly informed decision. And I'm reasonably certain that they don't have that. They think they do. They really do. I mean, they're sincere. But again, if you dig into this enough, it becomes pretty clear that information isn't available to most human beings.
just because it was on some infomercial with a Sarah McLachlan song playing in the background or something. That's the image that sticks with people. And it's traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to see, but yeah, I think it's important to understand that that's not even.
Well, and again, what I see when I hear her and whatever is, you've got puppy mills. Yeah. Okay. I got no problem, and often there's a psychological problem with the people involved there, right? I mean, like I say, these are tragic situations, not just for the animals, but for the people themselves. And again, we kind of lose track of that as well. So.
Another thing that a lot of people say is that cows live a very miserable life. They're in containment. They're always crowded together, that they got a really terrible life and then they're killed.
Okay. So everything I just said, let's just, so go see that. And then, these are animals that in the big scheme of things are a food source, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Just like a rabbit is, or, a small rodent is a food to an eagle or an owl, right? So, okay, that's nature. When they die in nature, they do so under far more stressful conditions than occur when we harvest them under modern management. Okay, we have to acknowledge this. It's hard to look at, but there it is. And again, people have worked at humane handling and processing and all of those things for a number of reasons, but those are things that people are looking at. Now, let's also take a step back and realize that we know that stress is bad for human health, right? Is that
absolutely
radical?
Yeah.
Okay. We can't perform at our genetic potential if we are chronically stressed. Same thing with animals. And in many cases, these animals are performing at a very high level when you look at things from a perspective informed by animal science and meat science and dairy science and these sorts of things. So now say, okay, what's your business? My business is converting grass into saleable product. We call it beef, lamb, goat, venison, dairy products, whatever. Anything that's going to lower the performance of those animals is a tremendous opportunity cost. And again, directly impacts sustainability. I mean, that's another thing that people they associate sustainable with natural. They associate, and they associate efficiency with something else. And the reality is that efficiency is fundamental to sustainability.
Interesting. Well, you've already mentioned human health. Let's go there for a second. Does red meat cause heart disease?
We have no high quality scientific evidence to say that. The only evidence that we have that suggests that is the product of something called nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease. It is by no measure sufficient to make the statements that have been made. I think the figure I saw was when the conclusions of that naked, to use the acronym, findings are tested in clinical trials, they fail 80% of the time.
Wow.
Now, if you were to flip a coin, you would hope that ultimately you're at about a 50-50, right?
Yep.
So to be that far off of random chance suggests there's a profound bias at work. And if you're familiar with any of the books by Nina Teicholz or Gary Taubes or many others, you understand the problem with that entire branch of human nutrition. And one of my cases that I'm trying to make to my agricultural tribes is we should stop citing that information.
Yeah.
It's contaminated our literature. You assume that they're as rigorous as we are. They are not. They have not been. They've failed in their duty, and they should be disregarded completely until they have demonstrated the ability to, one, accept their limitations, two, admit what they've done, and make effective change. And we see that they're not when we look back to 2019, when the Annals of Internal Medicine papers came out, basically saying that the best evidence available that we have is not to make any changes in red meat or processed meat consumption from present levels.
Wow.
And that's in the US.
Mm.
And so the short answer is no, but we do have another plausible explanation for what drives heart disease. And that would manifestly point us away from the consumption of processed plant products.
That's right.
And so you're now facing this dilemma that it is not saturated fat, naturally occurring saturated fats in animal source food that drives heart disease. It is not, the animal source protein that drives kidney disease. It is not the consumption of fatty meats that drives obesity. And it is not obesity that is then causing these chronic illnesses. It is, in fact, a manifestation of the metabolic derangement that leads to all of these.
Very well explained. I love that answer. Another one that everybody you just know, and I get this all the time when people tell me I would love to eat that diet. It's too expensive. I can't buy grass finished all the time. It's very expensive, even just ground beef. Does somebody need to eat grass finished and grass fed beef to do this in a healthful way?
No. Now let me elaborate. I'm all for producers having a range of options for their operations and selling to the public so long as they can make a profit doing so, because if they can't, they're not sustainable. Let's at least acknowledge globally all the feed that's consumed by the domesticated ruminant animal herd. Something like 96% of that feed is not human edible. Now, you have some purists that say, if it's grass-fed, it can only be grass. It can't be alfalfa. It must be pasture. It can't be silage or hay or whatever. I mean, this is ridiculous. But there are people there, and forgive me for being judgmental. There's no evidence to support that. Then recognize that even in the US, when we have a commercial steer, 90% of what it consumes throughout its life is not human edible. Okay? And that's a commercial steer going through a feedlot. If you look at the life of a steer from birth through harvest, you're somewhere around 3/4 of that animal's life is going to be spent on pasture with mama or after it gets weaned. And even when it goes into a feedlot system, if it does, it's still eating a lot of fiber in its diet. Otherwise, its rumen doesn't function properly. So people talk about a corn-finished steer or corn-fed. Many people think that's all they eat, and that's incorrect. Okay, so all of that background, then step back and say, okay, we can measure differences. And if you understand analytical chemistry, we have amazing technology to measure minute differences. What we absolutely lack is the ability to determine the biological significance of those differences.
Mm. Wow.
And so now let me just close, kind of put a bow on this by saying, we know that practitioners going back beyond the 50s, but if we just look, from the 50s, and you had all the people, up to Pennington, Donaldson, that informed Atkins, that informed Eads, and all the others who have come after. Most of those people didn't have grass-fed, organic, whatever as, available options. It turns out they didn't need it because their patients got healthy.
Mm.
So it's not a requirement.
I love
Can
that.
you afford it? Can you afford it? Is it accessible? Do you have a relationship with a farmer where you can get that? By all means. Okay. But it's not essential.
Mm. And I completely agree with you. A lot of that was really surprising to me when I learned it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're looking at it honestly, there doesn't seem to be much of a practical difference at the end of the day with some of that stuff.
There's an interesting thing now brewing in my life where there are people I know who've been very interested in phytochemicals. So plants produce a range of compounds. And these people who are friends and colleagues, and they're convinced that these chemicals have health benefits. And to be fair, they say potential benefits. And I am trying to make them aware that most of what we think we know about those substances in the population comes from this nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease. We think they're healthy because when we look at people who are healthy, they have more of these in their diet. Okay. Well, causation versus association. What we know is that people who are insulin resistant, hyperinsulinemic are not healthy. Let's get back to this. And then how do we address that? And what's necessary to address that? In one of the talks that I've given, I refer to Liebig's barrel, which is an example that I learned in soil fertility, which is that some element is going to be limiting. So let's say phosphorus is limiting for whatever reason in the soil. If I dump potassium or nitrogen or sulfur onto that crop, I'm not going to get an economic response. I may even get a toxicity because phosphorus is limiting. Well, okay, so, and the barrel analogy is, imagine a wooden rain barrel where you have different length, staves that make up the side of the barrel. So the phosphorus stave in this example is the shortest one. The barrel isn't going to hold any more volume, effective volume, water, whatever, than that shortest stave allows.
Wow.
Okay, so when I increase, now I add some phosphorus, and now phosphorus is no longer limiting, but something else is. Something is always going to limit. Some of those we can manipulate, period. Some of them we can manipulate economically. And then our job is to figure out at what point we can no longer do that. And we've addressed all the short staves that we can do. And I make the point that hyperinsulinemia, chronically elevated insulin resistance, is the short stave in public health today, in the US, globally. And until we address that, we really can't know anything about these others. I'm not saying they're not there, but I'm saying until we've addressed that one, we don't know.
That's such a great point. That's a great point. I love that. So we've talked about a lot about these myths and the things, that aren't necessarily true, but I've also seen the systems where this works. There's an episode of Chef's Table where the chef, I want to say Dan Dan Barker, I believe is his name. He wanted his food to taste better, and so he realized he needed to grow his own food, but to have the fertilizer, he needed to be in the animal business as well. We saw it with Diana Rogers' documentary, Sacred Cow, did a really great job kind of showing all the different farmers and showing the systems between plants and animals, and you need both. There was even a documentary released recently called Kiss the Ground, and this was actually done by vegans. I learned this from the Ultimate Health podcast. The executive director of Kiss the Ground, Rylan Engelhart, he describes being a vegetarian vegan, but learning that the soil was so critical that even against his own ideology, he had to acknowledge that you need animals there. And he got into the cow business and even consciously decided to kill one of the animals when it was at the end of his life. And I have so much respect for that. Like, you're not eating the same way that I would eat. However, you're facing down these issues and realizing that to get the best plants, you need animals. To get the best animals, you need plants. We can have both, and we can do it in a way that it's capturing carbon, bringing it back down into the soil. And we found a solution to some of our biggest problems around the planet, and we can help people's health.
Yeah. It's the best story that nobody knows. Number one, there can be no sustainable food system without livestock. Okay. Number two, a significant part of that livestock must be ruminants. Okay. Then on top of that, even in California today, under current agricultural practices, where do you think the fertilizer comes from for all the organic produce that's produced in California, which is the largest, I think, source of organic produce in the nation? It's coming from the dairies. It's coming from the feed yards. So, over half the world's fertilizer that humanity uses to grow the human edible crops, over half of it's coming from livestock manure. Over half of the world's farmers still use livestock for draft energy. Pull the plow, the cart, the whatever. The majority of the cereals in the world are coming from mixed farming operations in the low and middle income countries. Reality looks a lot different than the public conversation space. Here's one for you. So in the United States, we've already talked about it, 10% of all the greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to come from agriculture, forestry, and land use, right? We talked about that. At the same time, the amount of carbon sequestration today under current practice is equivalent to 12% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow.
So already today, agriculture, forestry, and land use is a net negative emitter.
Wow.
Now, we should also mention that agriculture is one of the few industries that's done the life cycle analyses so that we can have confidence in the numbers. Now, if we look globally, the global figure is somewhere in the 14-15% range total. And according to the IPCC, the same statement holds. Can it improve? Absolutely. And I can talk about great examples. But nobody talks about the fact that these sectors, which are essential, by the way, are net negative today. And then if you start looking at estimates of what could be sequestered if we could properly manage all the degraded and desertified soils and get them back up to whatever their environment would allow them to exist at for a soil carbon content, there's a limit to how long you can do that, and it's a relatively small number compared to what we're seeing. I mean, the figures that I like to throw out to people, especially people who are in college, because I see them, this is their professional lifetime, and I'm towards the end of my run. By 2050, it's estimated we're going to have to double food production Now, some of that can come from eliminating waste, but still significant increase. Number two, we're going to see a 2/3 increase in demand for animal source protein. That's a dramatic underestimate by my calculations. We're losing our agricultural soils. We're not making new ones, so that's a problem. By 2050, we're going to have to double the world's electrical generating capacity. By 2050, something more than 70% of the world is going to be living in urban areas. We're already there in the United States. The rest of the world is catching up. By 2050, we're going to have an older average age, right? So the population of the earth is getting older. Okay, so all of that we need to onboard as we think about the fact that today, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of children under 5 years old are stunted. A third of women of childbearing age are anemic, right? We have more people today dying of overweight obesity than we do from calorically undernourished, but it's all malnutrition.
Wow. Yeah, that's
You know,
staggering. Staggering to think about.
and you cannot address those things without animal agriculture. Most of those things, I think the evidence clearly shows, I may be biased, but probably am, by the way, but at least I'll own the possibility. Most of those are the result of too little animal source food in their diet.
I totally agree. Wow, this has been a really enlightening and amazing conversation. When, we're talking about these massive systems and things that need to change, they can sometimes be a little glacial to change.
Yeah. And again, I want to emphasize the best way for people to change these things is to improve their own health.
So that's our final question. What is one thing that somebody can do? How can they improve their health?
When you improve your health, you are improving the world. Full stop. You are that important. You have that kind of value, and you can have that kind of impact. You never know who's watching. Most of us would rather, watch a sermon than listen to one. So when we watch somebody else, that can have an impact. And then that impact can spread. And then at some point, some of us get to say, I'd like to work in this area. How am I best suited to do that? And then we go off and we do that. We have to get more people aware of this. And somewhere along the line, I picked up the statistic. I don't know if it's true or not. I like it. A tipping point is not 50%. A tipping point is more like 18. We're getting close. We're getting close. More and more people. And then everything shifts. If only because the market goes, wow, we could make money over there. And we're seeing a little bit of that, and there's problems that come with it, but it also drives change. And we need that as well. And we need people who are, I think of the nutrition as sort of the thin end of the wedge that starts splitting open the log, and now we start to question lots of things. Whereas before, it was a log. It looked solid. I use the image of a braided hemp rope, multi-strand, big thick one. Looks really imposing, really strong. That's the arguments that we're dealing with across this space. But my experience has been when we start unraveling those strands and we get down and test each strand, they start failing. Factually, objectively, they fail. And so then you begin to question, maybe there's not a rope there at all. Maybe this is just this conglomeration of worldviews and belief systems and narratives and stories and feelings. And, at the end of the day, policy should not really be formed on any of that, but unfortunately it is.
That's so beautifully said. We really appreciate you and your work. We appreciate your willingness to share what you've learned and to share it in a way that is, it's light, it's funny, it's serious, and we need to talk about this, but it's also very empowering to learn. And I've heard you say this before, and I absolutely agree. You are a bridge between these two worlds. There's kind of the agriculture world and the nutrition world, and we need to talk. We need to sort this stuff out because it's important that each side understands what goes into our food and then what foods we can eat to be really healthy. And you do such an amazing job by walking that line. Your podcast is amazing. We're going to link to that in the show notes. Where would you like people to go to find you and your work?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate what you say. You can find me all over social media, whatever you're interested in. I appreciate the links to the Sodcast.
I missed that one, the Sodcast. Shoot. I missed it. It's the Sodcast.
So did I, Casey. Somebody had to point it out to me. And then somebody said, please tell me you spell meat with an A.
I was going to ask you about that.
No, I'm not going to go there.
Too many puns.
There are some lengths to which even I won't go. You can find me on Twitter at grass-based, Instagram by the same name, one word. You can find me on Facebook. I have a grass-based health page. I have a blog that I keep struggling to get current. You can find me on YouTube by name, and if anybody wants to contact me, they can email me at pater.ballerstedt@gmail.com.
That's awesome. We'll be sure to link to all of that. Dr. Ballerstedt, thank you so much for, again, everything that you do. Thank you for taking the time today. The Holy Sodfather, thank you very much for appearing on Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you, Casey.
It's been a pleasure. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.